Hi, I am Tony Russo, and this is In Case You Missed It from Kates-Boylston for the week ending Friday, January 9th, 2026. Happy New Year. This is the first show of a new year. It's already been a long year. There's a bunch of stuff to get to and stuff that you need to know about, and we will get to all of it after these words from our friends and sponsors at Passages International. Today's families are asking for greener, more meaningful funeral options, but many funeral homes are still struggling to meet that demand. With 68% of consumers expressing interest in sustainable choices, the gap between what families want and what many providers offer is widening. For more than 25 years, Passages International has helped funeral homes stay ahead of evolving expectations with biodegradable, fair trade, and innovative memorial products that resonate with today's families. Discover how sustainability can strengthen your service offerings at passagesinternational.com. So I spoke with a really interesting woman this week. Her name is Martha Thayer. Many of you probably know her. She started the mortuary program at Arapahoe Community College. She has been running for the last year or so, maybe a little bit more, the Colorado Funeral Directors Association. And she's kind of a powerhouse in the area. And she talked to me about the new rules for Colorado funeral directors. Now, if you are a Colorado funeral director that did not go to mortuary school, that is, if you became a funeral director without going to mortuary school in the last 20-ish years since the license requirement sunset in Colorado, they are moving to make it so that everyone has a, quote, I guess, legitimate, unquote, license. And the way that they're doing that is by issuing everybody a provisional license. So if you've been a funeral director, you will continue to be a funeral director with this provisional license. And that provisional license becomes a regular license after about 2 years. It's 100 weeks of regular work as a funeral director and 100 weeks without any complaints to the DORA, the Department of Regulatory Authority, I think, or Regulatory Association, DORA. They're the regulatory place in Colorado. Anyway, so that is where Colorado stands as far as making everyone who didn't have a license have a license. And that will be the last piece of the puzzle. Whether and how well that will work to prevent bad actors is going to be a question. And it's always going to be a question because, the coroner, you'll recall in Pueblo, was recently discovered to have something like 24 bodies in his funeral home with his brother. So there's going to be still some adjustment period. And they are also talking about making it impossible for funeral directors to be coroners, and that could hit Colorado kind of hard because it's a big rural state and it's an elected position. And who else will do it? I feel like if you can run and you're not a doctor or a nurse, you ought to be a funeral director. You ought to have some familiarity with the death and dying process. But that's a story for later this year. This is going to be a rumdinger of a year as far as regulatory stories. And I'm looking forward to it. I got a bunch to do, but there's no link to that in the show notes because it's a conversation that I had for a story that I am writing that will probably be out in late January, but stay tuned. And in more kind of very specific state news, human composting, is also known as natural organic reduction, is on the legislative agenda in Utah. It is Senate Bill 49. And that's been going on for a while. There were a couple stories this week that I guess just got past me during the holidays. But what I want to bring up about this, and there is a link to this in the show notes, is that the folks at Recompose have provided for Utah funeral directors and Utah public people who are interested a kind of a form letter that they can send to their representative to show that they support natural organic reduction, if they support natural organic reduction. And I thought it was a cool kind of advocacy thing. I know that lobbying is something that's always going to be problematic for me. I know it's part and parcel of the way we do business here in America, and I'm sure lots of places that, that buying advocacy is for some reason important to us. But the idea of actually writing a letter to your congressman and saying, gee, I don't have $10 million, but I would like you to represent me anyway. I think it's wonderful that they're doing it. I don't know if it's time to call it quaint yet, but it's certainly heartening to see that people are still trying this kind of thing. So good on Recompose for putting this together. And if you're in Utah and you are interested in having natural organic reduction passed in that state and would like some guidance on what you could say to let your legislator know that you are interested, there's a link in the show notes to the story, I guess, that Recompose wrote, and also the form letter that they suggest you could use or borrow from. If you are an embalmer and you have strong opinions about the Pope's hands, do I have a podcast for you? The Dead Reckoning podcast not too long ago published an interview with a funeral director named Stephen Welsh, and he talked about the industry, and he did the regular I'm a funeral director kind of thing, and but he also talked at length about the, I guess, poor embalming of the Pope, misembalming of the Pope. If you'd like to look it up, you're welcome to. I did, and there's all sorts of rabbit holes. It's a very internet kind of thing. The best that I can tell, as far as, taking in all of the opinions, there are people who say that the Italians embalmed differently, and that's why his hands were weird. And his hands apparently were weird. I didn't know that either. If you didn't, now you do. So if you missed the Pope's hands controversy, you should definitely look it up online. Only because I didn't know that there was such a thing as an embalming controversy surrounding the Pope. It had to do with they embalmed him before they laid his hands together, and so they were flat, or they didn't embalm him until his hands were flat. If you're an embalmer, you know what I'm talking about, and if you're not, you should read up on the controversy. I'm really just pointing this story out, and again, there'll be a link to the Dead Reckoning podcast in the show notes. And if you're a podcast listener, the Dead Reckoning podcast is not a funeral podcast. It's things surrounding death podcast, but it's still definitely worth knowing about the Pope's hands. And while you have your podcatcher out, first of all, please subscribe to Funeral Service Insider, the podcast. But Death et Sec is a podcast, and it is hosted by our friend and a guest on our own podcast, and actually, I don't know if she's been on the podcast. I know that I've spoken with her several times for stories. Tanya Marsh, she's a law professor, and she has a death care style podcast. And this week she spoke with Dr. David Leslie, and he talked about ground penetrating radar and its uses not only for cemeteries, but also as an archaeological tool, and how that really kind of intersects with death care, because if you find graves where there used to not be a graveyard, maybe you found a graveyard. Tanya is also kind of in the news. It was announced this week that Cana would be presenting some of the findings from her 2025 death care symposium. We covered that in Funeral Service Insider not too long ago, and there are press releases out on what's going on in the Cana conference, the upcoming Cana conference. So links to all of those things in the show notes. But this was if you're into, ground penetrating radar or into death care cultural histories and legal histories. Death et sec. That's DEATH, ET space SEQ. It's Latin. And you can look up that podcast. It's worth listening to. So link to the show notes. And this is another story that we'll be writing probably later this month, because Matthews International made a couple of announcements before Christmas, and then recently this week they made another announcements about different divestitures and sales. This week they announced that, last week they announced that it had sold its European packaging and tooling business for $41 million, and it is part of the broader strategy that they've announced. Again, there is this proxy fight kind of looming over Matthews, and it's time to dig into that again and to see how that's how that's going. Maybe they gave up over Christmas, but I don't think so. So plenty more Matthews coverage coming up in the next couple of weeks. But there's a link to this story and the other divestiture they mentioned literally last year, in the show notes. So this is a little odd. I have two fire stories that I'm going to share. I originally just had one, but then there was another fire. So on January 2nd, the Kells location of Legacy Funeral Homes in South Anchorage, Alaska, burned, was damaged by fire, including all of the remains that were in the building, and they're still working to find out, where everybody is and kind of separate everyone and make sure that, all of the remains kind of go where they're supposed to. There were no injuries to the living, and as a result of the fire. And there are other locations in the area, so the families who were supposed to be served will eventually be served. And I want to be really gentle here, because this was a fire on January 2nd in Anchorage, Alaska. So I cannot imagine how brutally cold it was there. But then I reported on another fire that happened in a less frigid, cold area, and I'll talk about that in a second. The other story that I had already set aside, I had kind of praised the funeral directors and that for saving the bodies that were in there. And I just wanted to make a distinction between Amelia, Virginia, which is where this story takes place, and Anchorage, Alaska, where things are a little bit different on January 2nd. But the Hillman Hicks Funeral Home in Amelia was also the site of a fire on New Year's Eve. And there were funeral directors inside, and they were able to get all of the bodies out and put them, and keep them safe until after the fire had been put out. And they are already making arrangements for all of those remains. But I just loved the quote from Jim Hicks, who said, we would have the remains out before we got out. And then his wife, Carol, who said, that's right, they were out before I was. And it's a nice kind of nod to their dedication. I just don't want it to seem like I'm saying that anyone should have been out in the bitter January cold in Anchorage in the middle of the night for the same reasons. They're two different stories. They just happen to follow one another, and I'm probably making a bigger deal of that fact than I ought to. So I will move on, but there's a link to both stories in the show notes. I said this when I posted this following story socially, and I want to repeat it here in case you don't follow me socially. I am getting to the point where I expect to see stories about municipal cemeteries embracing green burial. It was quote news when I first started, like, oh, look at this cemetery's, either all green burial or no green burial. And there are all these arguments about, well, you can't have green burial for these reasons or that reason. Towns are beginning to think differently. And the latest one that I'm reporting on here is the Viroqua Cemetery, and that is in southwestern Wisconsin. And they are the latest, the first the first cemetery in southwestern Wisconsin, the first municipal cemetery in southwestern Wisconsin to offer a green burial section. And the story that I read was about the Driftless Green Burial Alliance, which was instrumental in getting the rules passed. But I think I would like to talk more broadly about the benefits of having green sections in your cemetery. Setting aside any arguments about whether you can do one, there are people who believe you can do green, not green, green, not green. There are people that believe you can't. That's not the fight that I'm here to have. What I am here to say is that if you have a section that is for green burial, that is a newspaper story about your cemetery adding green burial. And the curiosity factor is important because it's hard to just start. A lot of times it's hard to just start conversations about planning and about death and about what we want to happen after our demises. However, when you have something new to say, or when you have a question that you need answered, when people are like, what is green burial? That is a conversation about what you want to happen after you die to your body. And more than that, it opens up questions where there used to be none. People used to say, well, I guess when I die, whatever happens, happens, or my kids will do whatever they do. And there is still a lot of that. But when people hear that there are other options, a lot of times for people who aren't, neck deep in death care like we are, they hear that there are options, and hearing that there are options is really where I think a lot of whether this cemetery does gangbusters with green burials or whether it doesn't do gangbusters with green burials. The point is there's a conversation about whether and what kind of disposition to have in southwestern Wisconsin that wasn't there 6 weeks ago. And that, I think, is the big takeaway from a lot of these. The NOR thing, I've been saying that forever. If you live in Washington, if you live in Colorado, it is an excellent choice. If you live in New Jersey where it's legal, you're not going to get buried in New Jersey, right? They don't have the capacity for it yet, or they didn't as of the last time I checked. The point with NOR has always been that it starts, for me, has always been that in addition to, NOR as itself and green burial as itself, and these are great and interesting and rich topics, they're also catalysts. They're also a reminder. They're a memento mori, right? And they're a reminder that there are choices to be made that go with dying. Anyway, we will put a link to that in the show notes. And that will do me for this time. In case you missed, it is a Kates-Boylston production. It was written and edited and videoed by me, Tony Russo. Thank you so much for joining me. Welcome back. I hope you guys have a great year. Looking forward to the next chapter in death care that will be written this year. And, subscribe wherever you're listening now. If you have any requests, I'm always happy to field them. And you can email me. There's a link to my email in the show notes, and I will check in with you next time.